going to begin. I would like to welcome everyone, the panelists and the audience members and the support team of UASIS. This is the online launch of the Gruyter Handbook of European Union Environmental Policy. And I first want to just make clear a few housekeeping things. This launch is being recorded, and the recording will be put on the UASIS website where they keep recordings of book launches. One of our panelists who I'll introduce has a book that you can access, I think still, Rosa, is that right? It's still accessible on the UASIS website, and we encourage you to have a look at all the launches, including this one, for any purpose you might have. Because we're using the town hall format, we're going to use the question and answer icon, which you should see on the top bit of your Teams slide, for any comments and questions you have. And because, in a sense, we're not interrupting the flow of the conversation, you can start sending comments and questions, pleasant ones, impolite ones, whenever you feel in the mood. So without further ado, I want to first of all thank UASIS for supporting and making this launch possible. I have some other thank yous that I'm going to do, but particularly for De Gruyter for allowing this volume to come into being. My name is Anthony Zito. I'm one of the co-editors. Katarina Domaranek is I think somewhere in the audience. Together we've edited this handbook volume, and I'm going to be chairing the meeting and throwing in a few comments when the panel members get fed up. So what I would like to do, we're always told start with a puzzle, and so the puzzle I'd like to share is that back in 2021, I'd spent over a decade as editor of environmental politics, and I swore at that point, as I was trying to disengage myself, that I would never edit a journal again. At the same time, I made the conscious decision that I would never, ever edit a handbook because it's a year-long set of journal publications all at one go, and that would be a crazy thing to do. So how did I end up here as co-editor of a handbook for De Gruyter? For one thing, De Gruyter asked me, and you know, I think it's a topic I've been working on most of my life. But I think there's more to it than that, and this is something I want to just raise as some potential points for discussion. I think we are on the cusp with respect to European Union environmental policy. Whether you want to go as far as calling it a critical juncture or not, or you want more decades to pass before making that judgment, I think that potential is there. Now, some dynamics I think are out there and remain and are powerful. The questions of issue attention, things flagging up on the agenda, and then people losing interest, policymakers losing interest is there. Nevertheless, I think if you start seeing, as is stressed in the handbook, a world of turbulence in which you have range of environmental crises, starting with climate change, biodiversity, I would say chemicals is at crisis point, let alone human movement, which creates has its own environmental causes as well as environmental impact, geopolitical strife. All these things, I think, are testing and putting the strain on environmental politics and policy in the European Union. We also have an interesting dynamic about European Union policy being politicized, and at the same time, a lack of trust in both, more generally, not just the EU, but politicians, policymakers, policy experts, and even academic experts are being seen as less trustworthy. And this is an interesting realm in which all of us exist and work on environmental policy. And the final thing I think links to all that is the reality that we have a situation where a lot of environmental policy was designed for certain kinds of solutions. And the context and the problems and the demands are changing. So how do you change behavior as opposed to putting certain protective devices on large emissions plants? How do you change the way farmers work? So these kind of bigger, more systemic questions about how you design policy are on the table. So in this context, I thought, and Katerina agreed with me, that it would be important to do a handbook like this, that we need to take it stock, what's happened, and look into the future, and to try to think about policy theory and policy evidence, and try to involve a community, not just of established scholars, but take the handbook and try to get students, would-be practitioners involved in thinking about that. And so that's my hope for both this launch and for the handbook. And I hope we have a chance to talk about some of these themes as well as the other things that the panel wants to discuss. I'm delighted now to introduce the members of the panel. I'm afraid due to certain circumstances, Dr. Jana Goyens was unable to attend, but we still have a stellar panel. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak next. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Professor Charlotte Burns. Charlie is Professor of Politics at the School of Sociological Studies, Politics and IR at University of Sheffield. She works in all elements of EU environmental policy, politics. She particularly is known for work on the European Parliament, more recently, or both that and also focus on Brexit being the more recent thing happening, as well as a more wider sense of crises facing EU environmental policy. She has in her stable one of the classic politics textbooks published by Oxford University Press, Politics in the European Union, with her co-authors. She's on currently a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship looking at critical political ecology and applying it to the EU. So thank you, Charlie, for joining us. The next person is Dr. Rosa Maria Fernandez Martin. She is senior lecturer in economics and finance at Kiel Business School, Kiel University. She's a sustainable lead there. She has expertise in environmental and energy economics and policies. She has done a number of research projects associated with climate and sustainability. And currently, she's focusing particularly on corporate social responsibility, sustainability education, energy, and food sustainability. So thank you, Rosa, for joining us. And I look forward to your comments. And finally, Professor Andrew Jordan is director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia. And he's recognized for a huge range of research on EU environmental policy, governance, innovation. He's currently, or most recently, a committee member on the UK Climate Change Committee, one of the better governing tools in the UK with respect to climate change. Not to give you a plug, but I sincerely believe that. He's also on the College of Experts at the UK Office of Environmental Protection. And finally, he's also a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences. So now that I've done the introductions, the three panelists are each going to talk roughly for 8 to 10 minutes, depending on what mood they're in. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlie. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Tony. I don't know. I've got 10 minutes worth of material, but I tend to talk really fast, so I might not manage to stretch it. You missed out one key thing, the bit I'm most proud of on my CV, which is that I'm your former student. Tony was my MA dissertation supervisor and taught me when I did my masters in Newcastle, and got me interested in the European Union. So thank you for that, Tony, and thank you for asking me to join this panel, and giving me the opportunity to review a copy of the book. It's a great and ambitious undertaking. So I was quite entertained when you said that you were never going to do a handbook, because it is impressive. And I was really hats off to you and Ekaterina for wrangling such a wide range of topics and such a breadth of authorship as well. And one of the notable things that I really appreciated about it was the usual suspects are in here, all those sort of names that are very familiar to those of us who do EU environmental policy, but there's lots of new names as well. So that's great to see those new voices coming forward and contributing to this handbook. One of the things I'm going to talk about, lots of things I like, and then you've asked me for gaps, so I will move on to some of the gaps. One of the other things I really liked was the inclusion of subjects that aren't often in these kinds of collections. And some of those areas that people like me who've grown to be interested in critical political ecology are beginning to grapple with. And that's you've got a chapter on green citizenship, which was very big a few years ago and then disappeared a little bit, but we don't often see it in the EU context. So that was really nice to see that chapter from Amanda. You've got a chapter on non-human animals, and I've got lots of colleagues at Sheffield who work on that. But again, it's not something you see in EU environmental policy collections very much. That was great. You've got one on gender and one on migration, and I think those are really important topics that we need to be exploring more within the field. I also appreciate the inclusive approach that this isn't just about climate change, because there has been that climatisation of environmental policy literature more generally, and that you include the other key sectors. So air's in here, water's in here, waste, chemicals, biodiversity, food, which I thought was an interesting addition. But you also know how these sectors have suffered comparatively as a consequence of the increasing importance of climate on the agenda, taking up all the political oxygen. So it was great to see sort of chapter length treatments of those topics, but also that realistic sort of reflection on the fact that they're not getting as much attention as they used to. I think you do a brilliant job of capturing recent policy dynamics. It's really challenging with writing something where things keep changing, to both be able to pin stuff down and say something concrete, but also to try and catch hold of something that's moving through your hands as you're analysing. But I think you do a good job of reflecting on the increasing social and political contestation of environmental politics and policy making at the EU level, and then looking forward to identify future trends. So you asked me to note if there are any absences, and I think some of the things that I think I might be guilty of some presenteeist bias here. Some of the things I'm going to say, I think if you were commissioning the book now in 2026 would be here, but when you were thinking about it in 2021, we didn't know there were going to be such big issues. The first thing I'm going to say, though, isn't in that group. You don't have a chapter on agriculture policy, which I thought was a bit of an oversight. So I'd be interested to know why, if you want to share with us that in a tick. And you have biodiversity in there, which was great. And as you say, is one of the three sort of core challenges that's been identified by the UN. But I thought there was scope to do more on flora and fauna. Forests are a really big issue, and deforestation, wild animals, zoos, endangered species were all possible topics. One thing from the sort of more critical political ecology side, I like the fact that you brought different disciplines. I thought there was scope maybe to have something in here on ecocide, which again is a topic that's getting a bit more traction in the literature. Sustainable use of pesticides in the nature restoration law. Again, I think if you were commissioning this now, you might want to do a chapter length treatment of each of those. They are covered in some, at least in Vivian's chapter, maybe in some of the other chapters. But yeah, they've emerged to be quite important topics. And the other one, critical raw materials. Again, that's mentioned in passing, but I wonder if that would be worth a chapter length treatment on its own now, particularly given the changing geopolitical context. And there's quite a lot of interesting material coming out about, well, actually, these critical raw materials are going to run out because of their use in drones, for example. So yeah, there's some nice intersections there potentially. You don't have a chapter on Brexit, which I was very pleased to see because, as you said, I'm working quite a lot on that and finishing a book. So I'm very happy that you don't have that. But you do have a couple of comments, and one which I thought was quite interesting and which I agree with. I think it's in the Tobin and Minus chapter, is that maybe one of the enduring legacies left behind by the UK is the preference for deregulation. And we might be seeing that play out now with the Commission's omnibus and simplification packages. And again, if you were commissioning this now, you'd want probably a chapter length treatment on that. I think it's a bit early yet for us to know how significant the dismantling or retrenchment that we might see coming out of that will be. You do obviously, Paul and Ebba talk about retrenchment and dismantling. And I suppose a nice link there you reflect on in the conclusion, which I think Katarina Reitegg picks up on, is that we need to take a long view sometimes. So I think a future agenda will be comparing the current deregulatory phase with the earlier ones to see, are we seeing something different now? Because if you talk to practitioners on the ground, they will tell you it is different and it's unprecedented and it's going further and faster than previous rounds of deregulation have gone. So it'd be really good to put that to an empirical test. I guess the other difference I would notice now about the current period of deregulation is that changed political context, where we've seen the rise of the radical right, but also we've seen the presence of the radical right in European institutions holding positions of power and being able to shape the policy agenda in a way that maybe wasn't the case during previous periods of deregulation. And that raises some questions about, is this a long-term trend or is it a blip? Are we seeing a kind of a longer-term trend of polarization around environmental politics in Europe, which hadn't been the case historically? And then what does that mean? Is that around climate alone, or is it going to be over other issues? Another kind of key theme that's picked up by Paul and Ebba in their chapter on deregulation, that again, I think looking forward, we're all going to have to tussle with, is the use of new tools to gather large corpuses of data. And in my field, you mentioned European Parliament studies. We're seeing the increasing use of large language models to sort of gather European debates, to analyse them. And that's great. And I've done large N studies myself, but there are always those trade-offs. So yes, you can gather lots of data, but is it going to tell you anything interesting? And if you want to kind of get to the reasons why you're seeing particular patterns, we might still need those qualitative tools. So again, I think it's great that that's been identified as something that's coming forward, and it will be interesting to see how that's picked up in future across the field. So those are sort of, I mean, they're not really gaps, they're things that are identified that, but again, if you were doing it now, you might have longer treatments. And I think that's set against a really impressive array of topics, of disciplinary lenses, and of different perspectives. And then one final thing I'd say, particularly having been your student, is I really appreciated the recognition at the end that we need to beware eco-pessimism, and that as educators, it's actually incumbent on us to remind our students sometimes that things have got better. Yes, there's lots of things that could be better and things that are going wrong, but it's not all doom and gloom. So I thought that was a really good note to end the book on, and I applaud you for doing so. I'll stop talking now.
Charlie, thank you for those kind words and making me feel old as I'm feeling this particular Monday. I appreciate that a lot. What we're going to do, just for the sake of the audience, is please, any comments or questions, add them to the Q&A function in Teams. Start whenever you want. We're going to go through, rather than me respond or have the audience ask questions to Charlie, we're going to go through all the panelists. Then I'm going to open it up, and then I might respond to a few points when there's any lulls as well. So without further ado, then I'm going to turn it over to Rosa, please.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'll try not to repeat what Charlie has said, but there are a good number of common ideas that I definitely find interesting about the book. So thank you very much, first of all, for giving me the possibility of reading the book. I can only congratulate you and Ekaterina. It's impressive. The wide range of topics and the way that they all fit together, the way the book is organized in the 4 different sections really works, and it shows the cohesiveness between topic and between author and author, which is not easy when there are so many authors participating. So I really enjoyed that. And I also enjoyed seeing some things that perhaps are not so common when people talk about environmental policies, or some changes, particularly the chapter about turbulence. I really love the idea of not calling crisis each time that we face a change. And I wonder if when we talk about the situation in the European Union, we could stop calling everything a crisis each time that things do not go the way somebody expected them to go. Um, um, it may not always be a turbulence. It may well just be a part of dynamic, and the fact that dynamics are constantly evolving and changing. But I find it really interesting to have that idea of turbulence being included from the very beginning. I also, obviously, being an economist, like the idea of economic concepts and the difference of opinions and data use and the like that exists between economists or economic science and other type of sciences. I'm not sure if I totally agree with the idea that we use different facts. For me, facts are facts. Facts are the same, but the data that we extract from those facts will be different for different disciplines, and that is what makes that different rationales, different ideas emerge, and that different topics are given different levels of priority when different disciplines study certain aspects of the environment. I have to confess I consider myself sometimes an economist anti-economist. Perhaps that's why some of my colleagues do not take me that seriously, because I give a lot of importance to qualitative research and being in the field instead of analyzing large chunks of data with machine learning or any other econometric tool. So for me, it's reading this type of information is really interesting. In terms of perhaps gaps or things that may be or may not be there, Charlie mentioned that agriculture is not there, but the common agricultural policy is there, and food is there, and inherently the treatment on food has been mostly seen through the lens of the common agricultural policy. There is a chapter that also talks about the farm to fork strategy, but I would like to see more the dynamic and things that happen in the book. And if I might say say about my own book, I try to do that, looking at how we cannot look at policies from the point of view of the production of food, but the consumption of food is important, and that is for me a weak link in terms of how the EU does policy and politics. So that's one thing that perhaps these or other books need to give more attention to. You also asked me to look at things related to economics and sustainability. in general. I like the chapter that speaks about the business role as one of the policy actors. And I have looked myself at those aspects very often in my own research. For me, the key is that not all the businesses should be treated the same. And I think the chapter tries to give an idea about businesses being actors and mentions very briefly different types of businesses and different sectors. But I would like to see a little bit more detail on that in terms of how energy companies from the fossil fuel side have had much more power in influencing environmental policy across EU institutions and at national level, as opposed to renewable energies companies, because in a way, renewable energy companies seem to be kind of sidelined and put at the same level as NGOs or civil society organizations, and they are not, and they should not be in that sense. What I miss in the book, even if there is a mention of citizens, is communities of citizens and community groups per se as an actor, and community action other than looking at the civil society organizations per se. I'm thinking, for instance, of the definition that exists between communities of place and communities of interest, and how, for instance, energy communities have been established in different member states. And in that sense, perhaps the only evolution of the book that mentions circular economy, sometimes in a more positive lens and sometimes as a shortcoming. It's a very interesting dynamic how 2 or 3 different chapters talked about circular economy, the concepts and the use, and how it feels short. I think there are other ideas and concepts that have been circulating, like the donut economics one, that could be added to the mix at this point. And even the European Environment Agency mentioned the merits of donut economics as part of some of the ideas that could be added to the mix in policy making. I like that the idea that when mentioning actors, the European Environment Agency is mentioned as a research type of actor, together with the Joint Research Center. I think that's a big unknown, so it's really nice to see it there as well. And I don't know, the other thing that perhaps I would stick more with my more traditional conceptualization is one of the chapters is using regulationist economics, which I must confess I haven't heard the term before. I have heard of institutional economics. So regulationist economics is a new one for me. And the definitions that is given, I think it fits better with the more well-known term of institutional economics. But it's a really, really impressive book. I think my take on it is that the European Union is in a dynamic of turbulence and constant change, and unexpected outcomes of what in previous decades could have been considered good policies. And in terms of adding economic thinking to it, every single policy in the European Union and elsewhere for that matter is about the economy, because it all has a budget associated to it. And I think one aspect that the book is not mentioning, at least not openly is the idea of value for money, that I think in the last policies from the EU, the Repower EU and the Next Generation EU, the EU institutions have been putting much more emphasis on, and is how we get value for money. And that's why more evaluation and monitoring is taking place. So Jonas' chapter is also very important in that sense. And I think I'm going to stop there. It's a great book. Congratulations.
Rosa, thank you very much for all those stimulating comments. Without further ado, Andy, please.
You're on mute, Andy.
That's better. Okay. Right, start again. So thanks, Tony and Ekaterina, for giving me an opportunity to comment on the book. It's a super book. I'm going to do four things. First of all, I'm going to start off and look sort of panoramically at the whole book and identify a few chapters which caught my eye, and also perhaps a few things that I thought were missing. I then want to sort of zoom out and address a little bit the broader challenge which stimulates policy in this area, which is effectively the state of the environment. Thirdly, I want to sort of stay at the panoramic level and say something about the politics and policy, particularly in the light of the last 3 or 4 years, and basically asking whether EU environmental policy is still stuck in the sort of classic Downsian issue attention cycle, or has managed to liberate itself and address some of the challenges that I'd covered in the previous set of comments, and then finally look forward to the future. So first of all, the book. Yeah, I mean, 38 chapters, nearly 600 pages, 50 authors. I mean, it's quite incredible that you've actually managed to marshal all of this as editors into something that's really remarkably coherent. I think that the structure of it, of the book, I think is logical. Issues, actors, policies, pathways. I think that works really well as a sort of marshalling device. It's also incredibly detailed for a handbook. 3 pages, no less, of acronyms. So yeah, you've certainly not spared us as readers the detail. And I think crucially, I think it does really fill a gap in what is now an increasingly crowded market. So if you think about what's there at the moment, I mean, Helga Jürgen's Handbook of Environmental Policy, I think your handbook is more environmental than that, more European focused than that. You think about the Graziano and Tursun Encyclopedia of EU Public Policies, I think your volume is more environmental than that. I think the two closest competitors in the market are probably the Handbook of EU Climate Change Policy and Politics by Tim Rayner et al., published in 2023. It, of course, focuses primarily on climate change. And then, of course, the book that Vivian Gravi and myself have edited in 2021, a 4th edition, which I guess is targeted more at masters and undergraduate students. So I think, looking at the market, I think you've managed to pitch it really nicely. So what caught my eye? I thought I really enjoyed Annika Kronsel's chapter on gender mainstreaming and using gender as a way of thinking differently about the European Green Deal. I thought Dermot Turney et al.'s chapter on democratic governance and legitimacy was also really refreshing. I thought that was very good. And as Rosa has already mentioned, I really enjoyed Jonas Schoenefeld's chapter on evaluation, which that literature that tends to be seen very much as a sort of Cinderella subject, and I think more so than others, it really sort of moved away from, you know, how to do evaluation type studies to how is it actually done. I'll come back to this point later on, because understanding what's happened in the past and learning lessons from that is really important if the EU is going to improve going forwards. So what's missing? Well, in addition to what Charlie and Rosa have already pointed out, I thought one obvious omission was a chapter on the court of the European Union, obviously, but also courts in general, I thought were missing. I mean, that they're sort of covered in certain chapters obliquely, but no single chapter really focuses on them. And then secondly, and I think this point was also raised by Rosa, was this whole discussion about and concern about resilience of the EU, the belief that environment, climate change are not standalone problems, but they amplify problems in other sectors. They amplify risks. They cause risks in one sector to cascade into other sectors, and policymakers are seriously thinking about these things. I mean, look at the European Commission's 2025 report on its foresight report, identified climate change as one of 3 really important megatrends, or the European Environment Agency's work on governing in complexity, calling for more integrated, more anticipatory and more transformative policies. Also at the national level as well, a report by UK government, the National Security Assessment, really attracted a lot of attention, again, because it seemed to pinpoint the fact that environment is not a sector that sort of sits alone from other sectors. It interconnects with other sectors. I think 2 chapters do cover these resilience discourses to some extent. I think Tim Rayner's chapter on adaptation largely sort of underlining the point that actually until now the EU was focused very much on mitigation and a lot less so on adaptation and resilience. But also the Blochet chapter on migration, how, a bit like the UK National Security Assessment, how climate change can actually exacerbate migration pressures. So the challenge, well, I think what the book deliberately doesn't do, and I think this is covered in the opening chapter, it tries to raise questions, it tries to identify challenges. It doesn't try and arrive at definitive judgments of the state of the environment or the state of some of these problems that we've been discussing today. I think if one wants that information, the best place to go, I think, is European Environment Agency. Its State of the Environment report was published last in 2025. This is a really good time to be taking stock of where the EU is. If you think that lots of commitments were made around the time of the European Green Deal and also the European Environment Protection by 2030 report. I mean, these sort of reports say, well, the EU has actually made quite a bit of progress on mitigation, on reducing pollution in some areas, and on addressing waste and, to an extent, circular economy. But there are still massive challenges, despite 50 or by 20 the 30s, 60 years of policy making. Biodiversity loss, for example, adaptation to climate change. It was the European Environment Agency in its first climate change risk assessment, which identified or underlined the fact that the Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world, and water resources as well under significant stress. So, to quote the executive director of the European Environment Agency, yes, the EU has really significant transformative ambitions in this policy area. But really, to quote, the underlying sustainability trends remain largely unchanged. And I think that's quite a sobering conclusion to arrive at after, yes, decades and decades of policy making. So what about the politics? Well, I mean, Rosa and Charlie have already identified the importance of the rise of the far right populist parties. Add to that COVID, Ukraine, Iranian war, Trump, etc., etc. I think I agree with Tony, you, when you said that the EU was at a sort of an inflection point or reached a cusp. I think that point, if there was one, was around the time of the 2024 elections, when suddenly the Commission, and particularly the second von der Leyen Commission, started to pivot much more towards, issues of competitiveness, innovation, and there has been some progress in relation to things like the CBAM, in relation to ETS2, in relation, you could even argue that the adoption of a 2040 emission reduction target. But many of the priority areas that are identified by the European Environment Agency are also the areas that are now really in the crosshairs of those trying to simplify and possibly dismantle policy. So think about the nature restoration law, for example, very slow to be adopted. The deforestation regulation implementation is going to be delayed, and the Habitats and Birds directives, two of the absolutely keystone policies of the EU, now decades old, are the ones that were targeted first of all as part of the sort of competitiveness compass / omnibus regulatory analysis process. So the conclusion that one could arrive at, well, yes, the EU seems to be making progress in areas where progress is already being made, and struggling a lot more in the more challenging areas where perhaps greater progress at least was being sought, at least by the European Environment Agency. So finally, the future. I think, yes, a lot of what would need to be done to really address the environmental sustainability problematic would require really fundamental changes in production and consumption. And I think, yes, I think the handbook's right. I think huge strides have been made. Certainly if you go right back to 1972, through processes of multi-level reinforcement, of accumulating marginal gains. And yet we sort of now stand at this point where, policy is not suddenly surging forward. We're not seeing a sudden transformation in the effectiveness of policy, but nor are we really seeing significant dismantling either. So, yeah, depends whether one wants to see the glass as being half full or half empty. I think the book does end on a sort of positive note by saying that, it is by learning about what the EU has done that we can prepare the EU better for the challenges going forward. And yet, a handbook like this, which contains really basic information about how policy is made and could potentially be of enormous benefit to policymakers and also citizens. So much of it, though, sits behind paywalls, and which is a real shame. The market leader here really is the Tim Rainer book, the whole entirety of which is open access. But all the other books that I mentioned in my sort of tour of the sector at the beginning are either almost entirely behind paywalls or mostly behind paywalls. So if anybody's got any really bright ideas of how we get this material out there, either through open access platforms or through other ways of disseminating like policy briefs, then I think, yeah, it would be really good to hear them. So thank you, Tony. I think you did the right thing, you and Katerina, to take on the challenge. Thank you to UACs for organising this session. And yeah, I look forward to hearing what other people in the call have to say about this wonderful handbook. Thanks.
So thank you, Andy, for those lovely comments. I'm looking at the moment at the Q&A and I don't see anything unless I'm not clicking the right thing. I'm seeing no questions or comments. Please, if you feel you have comments that, or you don't have to ask questions if you want to see Zito is a bit of an old fool, you can go right ahead and issue that. While we're waiting to see if anyone's typing some comments, I'll go to a couple points maybe for discussion. I mean, one of the issues with doing a handbook about this is what do what do you directly give a chapter to, and what do you try to have as encompassing themes throughout? And agriculture, law, and economics were ones where we decided we're not going to sort of say, here's your chapter on economics, because it's all about that. Here's your chapter on agriculture. Well, water, food, uh, waste, climate emissions mitigation. It's agriculture is everywhere, and so the kind of thinking was to trying to make some of it problem oriented around the impact of agriculture rather than having it focus on that. So that's the choice made rather than having a particular chapter on agriculture or having a particular chapter on the court. But of course, because no one author's laying that out very explicitly, that there's a trade-off. And with this handbook in particular, Katerina and I wanted to, in a sense, only give a rough brief and let the authors go with how they wanted to run with it, what they really found challenging and interesting. And that went down certain paths we were expecting and then didn't touch things we were kind of more expecting. So some of the court discussion, in a sense, didn't happen where I sort of anticipated. In some of the right-wing populism that I was sort of setting up chapters that might discuss that received less of a focus. In the aid, rather than have me just ramble on, I'd be curious. I mean, one thing I have now consciously, as Charlie is painfully aware, my university largely has me teach European Union, and so actually teaching European Union environmental policies only happened in the last 5 years at Newcastle, but it quickly became noticeable as I go through fantastic data from the Environment Agency, how bleak it is looking on a lot of indicators. And so I've ended up telling them, please do not despair. We simply can't afford that. And then the question is, well, how do you have a positive message out of that? Just wondering if the panel has a view. How do you keep everyone around you positive, including yourself? Anyone want to tackle that? Yeah, Charlie, go on.
Well, so one of the things I do with my students is I share sort of memories of pollution from when I was younger. Stories like, acid rain being a really big topic when I was a kid, and, programs telling you how to design, like use spoons to draw lines on to measure rainwater, but then testing it for its acidity level, right? That's quite bleak as a kid. And that's one of those problems that I'm not saying it's completely solved, but that's one of those issues that we've dealt with. One can look to ozone depletion, and that would be an issue that we've been able to deal with. And those are also quite nice then as a learning tool to say, okay, well, why were we able to, or why has there been a capability to deal with those problems, but others seem to be more intractable? I think also getting people to think about, okay, well, what about where you're living and what's your environment like, and is that better than in other parts of the world, and why might that be the case? So yeah, I think the scope to sort of reflect that some things have definitely got better, and that shows that we're capable of solving problems, and other areas haven't, and then that's, yeah, as I say, an opportunity to think through why these other problems seem to be more intractable.
Okay. Thanks for that, Charlie. Andy, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I think it is important to be positive, and in fact, there's good reasons to be positive, and I think that's why I did quote the European Environment Agency's State of the Environment report, because there are lots of trends that are moving in a positive direction. Not all of them are. Some are, stubbornly seem resistant to effective policy making. So yeah, I think that audiences, whether they're business audiences, whether they're civil society audiences, they respond much more to positive messages, we can change this, than they do to doom mongering and gloomy prognostications of impending doom. I think, coming to your point about what you covered and what you didn't cover, though, I mean, it's incredibly difficult in a book like this. You as an editor, and I've done this myself, you have no carrots and you have no sticks. You've got no money to pay anyone, and you certainly don't have any sticks to beat them with if they don't come up with what you produced, what you wanted them to produce. But I want to say something positive and supportive about handbooks like this. They're not great for ref, but they mark you out, and if you're an early career researcher, this is important. They do mark you out as an expert in an area or sub area. They are definitely worth doing, and other people in the field take note of who's in handbooks like this and think, oh, actually, that was a nice chapter. I'll get them to write something else, or I'll think about collaborating with them in other ways. So definitely worth doing. I think, of course, though, that we didn't want to kill you, though, Tony, by asking you to write any more than 38 chapters. So maybe these things that we've just identified in the last 10 minutes can be something for volume 2.
Look forward to you writing that one, Andy. Cool. Go on. Enjoy. Rosa, did you want to chip in anything, or I can throw in another opening question while we see if anyone wants to write any comments?
I think there are several questions already in the Q&A. So,
are there?
Oh, yes.
I can't see them.
Okay, so do you want me to read the first one?
Yeah, please.
So, yeah, thank you, Vivian. You end the book on a positive note. How did your understanding of EU environmental policy and its successes and failures change during the process of editing the book?
Okay. All right. So that's to me. Oh, sorry. I didn't. Shows you how little I use this function. I didn't hit the right questions there. Okay. Right, and then there's something from Peter Eckersley. Apologies to everyone.
And something from Ben Reynolds too.
Why? Because I don't want to do all the talking. Why don't we start with the Ben Reynolds question, which I'm going to read out. Just I don't know if actually everyone can see the questions. You have to hit new post, which I hadn't done, so I hadn't seen that. Apologies for me berating the audience unfairly. What can we start with the Ben Reynolds quote and just get the panel's reaction, and then we'll go with Pete's, and then I'll reflect on Vivian's. Okay, how's that sound? So, does anyone want to have a stab at Ben's?
I can give it. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Go on. No, go on.
Rosa, go first, and then Andy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And answering Ben's or trying to answer Ben's question, I'm not sure the council presidencies are going to have that much of an impact in terms of environmental policy, because the EU as a whole is focused on what they consider more pressing issues at the moment. So if anything, we would see probably more attempts of simplification, because there will be more attempts of at getting things done quickly by businesses trying to go more or deeply into that competitiveness and growth discourse. That's, I guess, a little bit of a bleak view, but I think it's realistic as well, given what we have seen in the recent past.
Thank you, Rosa. Andy, did you want to jump in on this one?
Well, I think what the research in the past has shown, research on dismantling and termination and reduction has shown, is that generally you have to look very, very carefully to find any really, clear-cut examples of where policies have just significantly regressed. Where you do find policy struggling is where it's not keeping up with the state of the environment. Problems, in a sense, are either getting too stubborn or becoming too pressing and too significant for policy to catch up with them. So I think the two stimuli for future policy going forward are either an increase in problem pressure, and I did note some of those potential ones in my summary comments, or secondly, the people going out on the streets again, like they did, before the European Green Deal. The children, families, parents taking to the streets. That's what really pushed the European Green Deal. It's what encouraged Ursula von der Leyen to talk about man on the moon moments and things like that. But yeah.
Charlie, did you want any word on that, or are you happy to?
Well, so I just quickly reminded myself of the order of the next few presidencies. So I was like, who is it? And I suppose the one, so Italy's at the beginning of next year. No, what year are we in? Are we in 2026? Yeah, so Italy's in January to June 2028. That will be the one I would be worried about. The others I would be less worried about for the kinds of reasons that Andy's identified a little bit, that these tend to be quite long time frames, and I'll be looking at the Commission. I suppose it's what signals is the Commission getting from the Council, and what else is going on in the world in terms of driving sort of policy agendas at the European level. So Ben, I'm afraid that's not a very helpful answer to your question, but it's a really good question. Thank you.
I mean, just to give my own thoughts on it, Ben, it's an excellent question. I mean, you could turn the Greece-Italy nexus. I mean, and this links to Andy's point about climate adaptation. If we get some brutal, fires, Italy and the sort of Mediterranean or Greece, that you have the potential, depending on when elections are, for a bit of a shift and potentially a bit of a push. Now, this is in the context of everything else. How much bandwidth there would be for a Meloni, if she survives that long, and so far she seems no indication of not surviving, to have that, to have a kind of environmental platform. It's possible that that this may be a kind of impetus that we don't expect that it comes from. By contrast, some of the usual, I think this comes out well in the handbook, even though I would say that in a sense, some of the usual suspects for leadership might not be that positive, that whether they've got domestic political distractions, whether they've got issues of populism, right-wing parties, desire not to annoy their farming sector, and so forth. So I think the wild card is the kind of adaptation trigger that might push certain governments we see as not being particularly progressive and anticipatory, or at least being more reactive to environmental events as things change, perhaps in the Mediterranean. Well, thank you for that, Ben. Oh, Charlie, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, can I just come back on that a little bit? Because it's quite interesting if you look at the legislation that's been adopted recently on I can't remember what it's called, but adapting to crises, where clearly what the EU is talking about is adaptation to climate change. Emergencies, is it, rather than crises? But it's all framed as these are civilian emergencies rather than these are adaptation to climate change. So there might be something quite interesting there discursively about how addressing those big sort of climate adaptation challenges at European level get framed. Like, we can do something about this as long as we don't mention climate change, as long as we only talk about floods or fires and don't make the link, then we'll be able to get that through politically. I'm sort of getting the sense that that's a bit of a trend at the moment. Whether or not that will continue, I don't know.
Thanks, Charlie. That's really interesting. Can I suggest we switch to Pete's question about potential for impasse with certain increasingly complex, and I expect implicitly linked in there is that these are complex and interlinked environmental problems. Does anyone want to tackle that question to begin with? Andy, do you want to have a go?
Well, I kind of already made the point that EU environmental policy making seems to be sort of stuck. You know, it can't make a decisive move forwards in a more transformational, direction. I mean, transformation arguably has started to occur in sectors like cars or generation of electricity, but it's difficult to see many other examples of genuine sort of transformational change, and that's why I think, the executive director of the EEA made that very point. I think that. But yes, struggling to transform, but also somehow not able to, for the reasons that have already been given, to significantly revise and update the existing acquis. So yes, I don't know whether that's what you meant by a critical juncture, Tony. Kind of can't move forwards, but also isn't moving back. Was that the essence of your point?
I mean, I think there is. My understanding of critical juncture, and people can correct me, since it's an open season on what people mean by critical junctures. You might have a better definition, but I think certainly in terms of global North environmental policy, it's non-decisions as much as it is decisions, right? I think there is scope to take decisions. As some of you, I think, know, I'm not too keen on, certainly Peter knows, I'm not too keen on wicked problems as a blanco explanation, because I think a lot of things are just politically difficult. And we are in this moment where some of the necessary but politically difficult things, and I think going back to Rose's point about, under focus on consumption, the idea that consumption models in the EU don't have to change, that somehow technology and production, all that around consumption is going to ameliorate environmental issues. That is a considerable problem. Anyone else want to speak to Peter's point? In which case, I'm going to and feel free. I guess this is pitched. Vivian's pitched this towards me, but you might, if the panel has some thoughts on this, don't hesitate to sort of say. I think, in some senses, the book is a lot of my long-standing prejudices, and they haven't changed. I'm sorry. I've been studying EU environmental policy explicitly since 1990, and there are certain things that I think about its trajectory, and that hasn't necessarily changed. I think one of the things that I would have given more of a focus on now, I mean, I joke that I've had several midlife crises, and one of them was I decided to hang around cultural heritage people and creative arts people, and it's led me to deal with another kind of midlife crisis, which is, I talked to anyone who was willing to listen about Brexit, but I just couldn't cut through it. at all with any sort of saying, well, look, there are these issues and these are things you need to think about, even if you think that the EU is hopeless. And so it begs the question of how we make that link between policy elites and the communities. And I think partly that is and going to have to be, because that adaptation is only going to get more and more important if we project the way climate change is going to go, that finding resilience within the communities, but also empowerment of the communities and making the communities work with each other, even if they don't trust central government. I think that's something that I've been learning to grapple with, as well as the challenge of dealing with raw earth materials. That when I started the book, those are things that were in the forefront of my mind. So I don't know, that might sound very lame, Viviane, as a response, but that's my instant response. I mean, that question was more reflective, but did the panel want to jump in or correct me on anything, or jump in on that? Are you happy to move on? Okay, let's move on then. And we're going to tackle Ferdinando's question. Okay, classic question of degree of politicization and contestation, and trying to plot different policies along this. Does anyone want to speak to this? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a live debate, isn't it, in EU studies? There's a piece by Pierre from 2024, I think, in JCMS, which kind of suggests, well, the Commission's prepared to sort of back climate change and wasn't prepared to stick to its guns on the sustainable use of pesticides and the nature restoration law, and that's something about the farmers' protests and the degree of politicisation around those subjects. And for me, I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's a really interesting research topic looking forward. If we are going to see this ongoing politicisation of EU environmental policy, which has historically been relatively well preserved from that kind of national scrutiny, if we're going to see that ongoing politicisation, is it going to be all areas of environmental policy, or are there going to be differences, and to what extent is that going to be shaped by the national context and by the, and if we're assuming that politicisation is linked to the growth of the radical right, is it about the different radical right parties and what kind of power they have within states, because they'll take different positions? They might all be relatively climate skeptic, but then on other environmental issues, they will take different positions. So I think it's a great question, but I don't have an answer.
Anyone else want to chip on that panel? Yeah, Rosa, go ahead.
I may not have an answer, or an answer that is going to be well-liked, because I think we have both things happening at the same time, and we have some areas of policy reaching different implementation challenges because of the economic cost and the idea that when the policy is created already without enough budgetary allocation, and the other is the politicization, in national politics, and how those national politics also influence to which extent a particular environmental topic or area is pushed towards the Brussels agenda or not at particular moments in time. So I don't think we can distinguish so many of those policy areas where only one of the two things are happening, because both things are happening more often these days.
Yeah, and if I jump in on this question, which is an excellent one, for me, I think that for me the interesting story is I think politicization, contestation is happening with certain areas, but a lot of worrying environmental policy areas just do not have that visibility. So waste is on every level whatsoever is something that is displaced to the global south, be it electrical waste and all these sorts of things. So for me, there is a kind of issue attention dimension to this that, chemicals, I mean, there's more awareness being raised about pesticides and these sorts of things. But nevertheless, I think there is a kind of policy agenda, political agenda maxim about environmental. There is a kind of maximum sort of scope to take on some of these equally complex, equally important issues that we're not seeing. And for me, that I think is more a story of the differentiation. Charlie.
I'm going to argue with you a little bit about waste. So I think at the local level, that is incredibly politicised. I think if you went to Birmingham or, if you went to Northern Ireland, I know Vivianne's on the call, waste dumping's been a huge issue there. So, but I think what's interesting is EU waste policy is not necessarily controversial, and the consequences of those policies maybe don't have that political on the site of political contestation, but local implementation of them definitely is.
Yeah, and I take that point. I was talking more of the EU, but yes, car parks, planning, just about on the local level, well-off communities, poor communities, all these are battles in terms of people's well-being, and I accept that point. Charlie, you want to jump in again?
Well, I just wanted to ask you a question, because you said, you've been doing this for a long time and reflecting on EU environmental policy for a long time. And one of the things, if you look at the sort of the longue durée, has been the adoption of that sort of ecological modernisation frame to articulate environmental problems and then solutions based on that kind of economistic discourse. And one of the things that we're seeing around the politicisation and contestation is that being increasingly challenged, that it's not a win-win discourse and there are clearly losers. So did you have any reflections on that as you were bringing together the handbooks? I suppose another one of your themes might be just transitions, which again, there isn't a separate chapter on, but I'm sure comes up. So I wondered if you could just reflect on that for us, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, for that. It's an important question. The short answer is that in pushing to have a chapter on non-humans, on pushing gender, I could have gone a lot further down intersectionality in terms of global South. We were trying to do at Katerina and I, we're trying to allow spaces for that kind of intersectional analysis, because I think if you start looking at the ecological modernization project, the assumptions it makes, everyone's a winner. There's no power differentiation. There's no wealth differentiation. There's no technological differentiation. The joins and the impact, whether it's on left behind communities in Northern England or Indian beach communities that have the container freight ships stranded to be dismantled on their beaches. There is, I think there is a disconnect. A perhaps potentially problematic thing is, and I'm very aware of me trying to offer, and this is one reason why I wanted to do this more as a handbook than as an authored book, is because I am a white elderly male from the United States, and my I'm aware of the privilege and the perspectives in which I operate. So for me, the handbook was partly to try to allow elements for people to be quite radical and uncomfortable, and the critiques of mainstream European integration. I get what you could pigeonhole me as being part of that mainstream, but also this assumptions of environment and what's environmental progress, and you know, and how do you bring communities with you? Sorry, I feel like I'm starting to ramble, so I'll leave it there. But it's an excellent point. Let's see. I'm just trying to see if there are any other questions that.
I know we agreed I would not speak, but
Oh, Katerina, yeah, please
Hi.
go for it.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you and then Daniela and the panel, obviously, for the positive feedback and further inspiration thoughts. And I would like to address very briefly 2 points. It's one of the positive and maybe positive note we concluded this book with. It's like, and also connected to other issues you raised during the discussion. I think the EU environmental policy has been sort of moving target for us when we were working on the handbook, because first we were somehow, you know, everybody got enthusiastic about the European Green Deal, and then some dossiers were approved. But then we start looking at it, it's a sort of green lash or dismantling or whatever, encouragement, we can define it in many ways. So at a certain point when the Clean Industrial Deal came out, it looked like, okay, now we put a black cover on this book and maybe it's not going to happen. I mean, all this green, but yeah, now you're suggesting new topics. And the last point, Charlie, you suggested, I think this is an amazing point, and all the like gaps or potential like further developments for the book just confirm that there are more research pathways or more topics for further discussion and investigation. So it is great that, and I think this was also, at least for me, also the intention of the book. Of course, it could not be sort of comprehensive, all-inclusive contribution, because it's just unthinkable to cover all the policy areas and sub-areas which are relevant for EU environmental policy. But the direction that you emphasized, and maybe because I have bias on this, I have been working a little bit on just transition and the eco-social connection. I think this is something which has been really challenging the foundations also of this green turn in the EU policy making, because all of the recent challenges connected also to the revision of the European Green Deal, maybe a partial dismantling, were actually related to the concern, public and political concern, about the fact that who is going to pay for it. And apparently it looked like poor people, or a huge majority, let's say, of EU citizens were quite concerned about the costs of green transition or more drastic green. And that's why, yeah, it's the conflict or tension which may be worth looking at, also from the environmental policy perspective, which somehow may be neglected the social risks and costs of transition processes, just because we think that environment is obviously good, but it needs to address several issues in terms of economic and social development, of course. So, but yeah, thank you very much for your comments and for being part of the panel. And thanks again, Tony, for engaging me in this fantastic project.
Hey, well, you're very welcome, Katerina. We have a couple more minutes. Can I just thank Ben? He had a follow-up point, which is well considered, and I agree. I think if there is a confluence of events plus the elections, you can't rule out some of Meloni's party seem to be very Tolkien-esque in their mindset, and so, you know, links to nature and old ways. You can't underestimate sometimes how that dynamic might explode onto a national scene, perhaps. So I do think that's a very interesting thing. I want to do some thank yous towards the end, but this is just a chance. While I'm waiting to see if any other comments or questions. It looks like we've dried up on that. Did the panel have any last thoughts they wanted to offer to the group? No need if you feel like you've shared them. Andy, do you have anything you're dying to say? And
I just wanted to thank you, Tony and Ekaterina, again, because I think these handbooks are, you know, the big things to take on, and yet they are a real service to the academic community. they're a fantastic teaching resource. They're a fantastic way of signaling, particularly for early career researchers, that they're a important member of the subsector, the community of practice. But they take a lot of time and effort to put together. So I think on behalf of the community, thank you both for what you've done.
Well, that's very sweet, Andy. The check is in the mail, so I still write checks. So I'll send that to you later, in addition to the handbook. But my hope, and I know it's Katerina's, is that we've tried to. I mean, two things I think it's worth pointing about the handbook. One is that we've tried to instill a sense of community with the handbook, that there's an intellectual community moving forward, and I hope that will. I know Andy and I at various points looking towards the future, but partly that future also involves having young, exciting scholars doing things. And what we've tried to do in the handbook is try to reach out geographically, which sometimes was a bit of a struggle, trying to locate people on certain topics beyond the kind of usual suspect countries and trying to push that. But we've tried to do that, but with an eye to younger scholars. And the other thing I'd mention is that we deliberately went for 6,000 words to give people the ability to chew on topics and to provide detail, to get into the heart of it. Now, if we could have tackled twice as many topics and then got a much more explicit range of that, but we wanted to go in to try to get people more into a topic and a way of thinking and a way of theorizing it rather than having that. So that was kind of the conscious choice that we made in the handbook, but it has the consequence that certain topics don't get as much of an explicit focus. We only have 5 minutes left. I don't see other comments or questions. Can I thank, first of all, the kindly people who have offered us questions and comments. They're all excellent comments. I really appreciate them. I want to next thank the panelists for all their very thoughtful and kindly and polite conversation, gambits and questions, and being gentle with the handbook and me and Ekaterina. While I have this opportunity, I want to thank Ekaterina for her co-editorship, but also I haven't mentioned Daniela. I can't see the list of audience, so I don't know if Daniela is here, but Daniela Poe assisted us wrestling with various drafts of various chapters and looking through them and organizing them and formatting them and doing that humongous acronym page. And so I wanted to put on this recording both Ekaterina and my thanks to her especially. And I hope at some point she gets to see these comments. Next, I want to thank De Gruyter for giving Ekaterina and myself this opportunity. It was something I never planned to do, but I am glad now that we've done it, now that in fact it is done. And finally, I want to thank UACs for giving us this opportunity to showcase these issues. I take the point about open access, but my hope is that in some sense by having these events and maybe going forward with these events, we ameliorate some of the publisher focus on paywalls and all of that by having open discussions of ideas, admittedly not necessarily tied to open access publications. So with that in mind, I think, unless anyone else has anything to say, I can't see anything, that I'm going to thank everyone once again and wish you all the best for the summer. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you again, panel, for all your contributions. Much obliged. Thank you, Carrie and Daniel, for all your work. Bye-bye now. Bye.